It is time to start setting the table for week one against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, NFL Draft Lead for the 33rd team. You can find all of our shows here on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast on the Locked On Network. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. Here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. It's almost game time for the Miami Dolphins. Getting ready they'll now play 2 football games in 9 days, 10 days, 9 days, depending on how you round up the current day. Do you feel it? And it's hoodie season where I'm at, so we got a little twinge in the air, and we're gonna start to set the table for Jacksonville. We have an extra day's worth of podcasts versus a typical game week, so we're gonna look at the Dolphins and their health and availability. We're gonna look at Jacksonville and some of the things that they're going through. Just a general primer on who Jacksonville is a football team this year. A lot of changes, fundamental changes, but I want to start with the Dolphins. And Miami, we got a boatload of updates and injury updates from the team, from Mike McDaniel, from players yesterday. Open practice portion. Got a chance to see names like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and Benito Jones and Anthony Walker. And these guys are all back. And the Dolphins did the successful thing with Teron Armstead, keeping him on ice for the start of the regular season. So, Miami obviously had their fair share of injuries in the training camp portion. What was alluded to by Mike McDaniel for many of them was we're not treating injuries right now the same way that we would in the regular season. Aaron Brewer back yesterday as well. As a participant in practice, Mike McDaniel saying that he was confident with the state of affairs there. So players that Miami will not see. Miami took advantage of the new rules for on player cutdowns, putting players on injured reserve, opened up a few extra spots for a team that had more than 53 players that you would like to have on a 53-man roster. They put Cam Smith on injured reserve as an IR for return. He obviously will not perform. River Craycraft put on IR as an IR for return. Patrick McMorris stashed on injured reserve after cutdowns. We won't see those players who made the initial 53. And then you have Isaiah Wynn, Odell Beckham, and Bradley Chubb as players on the PUP. Some meaningful players, for sure. Bradley Chubb played some of the best football of his career last year for the Dolphins. You look at the Jacksonville side of things, and from a projected starter standpoint, they really don't have a lot of issues. Tashawn Gibson is probably a starter for this football team when he's healthy. He's on the suspended list. Suspended a few games. I believe it was PEDs was what he was suspended for throughout the course of the offseason. Andrew Wingard has played some meaningful snaps. He's on IR designated to return. And then another safety for them, actually, Doug Peterson said yesterday when talking to the media that they were kind of monitoring the health of Daniel Thomas, who's one of only 3 safeties on the active roster as things currently stand now. Darnell Savage came over from Green Bay in free agency. He was a former first-round pick. He's played in the nickel. He's played safety. He's present there, but between him and Antonio Johnson, who was a 5th-round rookie last year, those are 2 players for Jacksonville who are both probably better suited to play in the nickel as compared to playing high, and then that leaves Andre Sisco as this ball-hawking free safety that they have with excellent length and ball skills as a potential post defender for them, but the defensive backfield for Jacksonville is where they're a little pressed with guys that signed late in the process that you knew you were going to miss for a couple of games. Core special teams type player like Wingard. And now Daniel Thomas is a third safety in that room. That's just leaves a little bit of a question mark. The good news for Miami with their projected starters, Tyreek Hill says he's fine. Jalen Waddle's out of a red non-contact practice jersey that he practiced in all week last week. Your starting nose tackle, Benito Jones, is back. Your starting center, Aaron Brewer, was practicing yesterday. The only player who was not a participant, it's not a small player, it's Jalen Ramsey. From what I understand, there's not a lot of concern. This is, I believe, Jalen's first game against his old team. Every indication that I have been given is there's not a large sense of concern that Ramsey's going to miss the game. So, yeah, Bradley Chubb is out. Odell as your third wide receiver is out. River as your fourth wide receiver is out, and Cam Smith as your fourth corner is out. So both these teams, all things considered, there'll be some players whose status is definitively out or in question. Miami's list is a little bit longer, but all the names that everybody was been sweating for the last 2 weeks. What's the deal with Tyreek? He's got a thing on his hand. What's the deal with Waddle? He hasn't practiced. What's the deal with Anthony Walker? He hasn't practiced. What's the deal with Benito Jones? He hasn't practiced. What's the deal with Aaron Brewer? He hasn't practiced. They're all practicing. Because Mike McDaniel told you several times throughout the past 3 weeks, we're not treating injuries in the preseason the same way that we would treat them in the regular season when you are playing games that tangibly matter. They count against your record for the season. Now, I think the fortunate part of that for Waddle and Hill and Walker and Jones, Brewer's a little different because of his circumstances and his role as a cog in the offensive mechanics because he's the first guy to touch the ball in every play. Most of those guys, they've been around the block. They understand what they need to do, and I would throw Jalen Ramsey in that bucket as well. You'd expect everybody's going to be ready to go. The big pressure cooker, I think, this week is with Aaron Brewer, your projected starting center. Well, he's your starting center, let's be honest. Brewer, as the player who's responsible for the snaps, there were some snap issues early in camp. It's the kind of stuff that you can't have happen in the first week of the season. They got to get on the same page. They got to make sure their snap points. And the good news is they had a sampling of it for about a week and a half, 2 weeks before he suffered the hand injury with Tua Tagovailoa. And they had started to settle into Tua missed the first couple practices, and then he's back. So they had about a week and a half of overlap between the two. Teron Armstead, when speaking with the media before Aaron Brewer's injury happened, talked about, we were talking with Tua about Aaron's snap point and how it's a little different and what he has to do. You can't just sit around and practice and take snaps, but it's probably something for Miami. You got to be mindful of shotgun snaps versus under center snaps. How often do you go under center? How confident are you under center? And if Brewer needs the extra time, do you just go with Liam for week one, knowing that you have an extra 3 days of practice and preparation where you could kind of sort that out going into week two? They did that several times last year. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen. But you do acknowledge there were times where guys could have played that the team ultimately said, hey, you know what, from a preparation standpoint, we want to put everybody in the best position to be successful. And having the week of practice is an important piece of the puzzle. So if we're compromised there, we're just going to let the guy that we know can go. I don't expect that to happen, but you don't know until you know, and you won't know for sure until you go out on Sunday and you line up and you take your first snap. I would expect Brewer out there based off of just kind of the speculation that we've heard about what the state of affairs was with his recovery. Seemed like it was something that went okay. All severe outcomes were avoided. Just like I expect Jalen Ramsey to be out there based off of speculatory things, things that you kind of talk with people who are a little bit more familiar with the situation, what they're willing to give you. So unless you're on a designated list, I kind of expect everybody to be out there for Miami. Now, we're going to get into some odds and ends, a lot of odds and ends today. Jacksonville, who they are as a team, looking at their strengths, digesting what's new with them and contrasting it to what's new with Miami. So all of that's coming your way next year on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you stick with us. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, but we have something a little different for you for the start of the season. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season out of market Sunday afternoon game. All you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. Visit FanDuel.com to download America's #1 sportsbook. Jacksonville was a team that started hot last year. You looked up week 12, they beat the Houston Texans in Houston. They were 8-3, and they were getting ready to play the Cincinnati Bengals without Joe Burrow. This was kind of the Jake Browning breakout game, really. Cincinnati had 491 yards of offense and 156 rushing yards. And Cincinnati won that game 34-31 in overtime. A game that Jacksonville, frankly, should have won. I believe there's a kind of a questionable penalty in overtime that cost Jacksonville possession to get them in scoring territory. And then Cincinnati wins the game. Jacksonville went from 8-3 to 9-8. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly what the Dolphins did in 2022. Doug Peterson in year 2. You thought this was going to be the leap. They made it to the playoffs in Doug's first season. They come back from the, 27 to, is it 27-0? 27-0 deficit against the Chargers. Scores with 24 seconds left, a touchdown to get on the board before halftime. Come back and beat the Chargers 31-30. And then they lose to the Chiefs, give the Chiefs a really good game in the divisional round in 2022. Then they start 8-3. You feel like, okay, there's a breakout coming. This is the team that's kind of going to commandeer a really competitive division. Then Houston gets hot, and Jacksonville does what the Dolphins did the previous year in 2022 and finishes 1-6 down the stretch. There was some ugly stuff in that period, too. Their only win was against the Carolina Panthers, who finished the year 2-15 and would have had the #1 overall pick if they didn't give it to the Chicago Bears to acquire Bryce Young. They won that game 26-0. Trevor Lawrence got banged up in this stretch, missed some time, played hurt, wasn't really himself. They lose to Cincinnati in overtime. They lose to Cleveland in a 1-score game. They lose by 16 to Baltimore. They lose by 18 to Tampa Bay in Tampa. They turn the ball over 4 times against both Cleveland and Tampa Bay. They beat the Panthers to get to 9-7, and then they lose to the Titans with the Titans season effectively over. They finished 6-11, ruined a couple teams' seasons there at the end of the year. Tennessee did 28-20. Derrick Henry runs wild in his final game as a member of the Titans in that contest and cost Jacksonville a chance at the division. So that was the script last year for Jacksonville. It's a pretty talented team. I think they're probably more talented than 9-8 would indicate. I think if you are being fair to that team, they did absorb a lot of injuries down the stretch, but they also remade themselves in a number of different ways this offseason. A new defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen, who's a very well-regarded defensive coordinator. They like to play aggressive. And you pair that with a very physically talented defensive front with Trayvon Walker as the #1 overall pick from 2022. Josh Hines Allen, who had 17.5 sacks last season. They add Eric Armstead in free agency to go with Devon Hamilton, who's a really good nose, and then Roy Robertson Harris, and a second-round draft choice in Mason Smith. They get some bodies up front. Now, I think they're more potent inside from a depth perspective, where I think their true outside talent rushing the passer, Josh Hines Allen's an underrated player, probably a top 10 edge rusher in the league, if we're being honest. He had a new contract. It was originally franchise tagged. I think that's where, Miami and the matchups that they have from a skill group perspective can allow them to offset what I think Jacksonville does do up front. And we're going to do the crossover with Tony Wiggins, with Locked On Jaguars on Thursday. We'll get more into this team and these teams and how they match up against each other. But you acknowledge the injuries in the secondary with the safety room. for Jacksonville. So they're a little thin there. I would expect that they're going to call up one of the safeties that's on the practice squad. I'd guess Terrell Edmonds, who has some significant NFL playing time on his career. I'd expect they call somebody up to get another insurance body at safety, but Cisco's a really good player. Tyson Campbell had a down year last year, but it's a really good player. Now, I think it's kind of a poor matchup for Campbell against either Waddle or Hill, whoever he draws in assignments, just because Campbell's more of a long player. He's not the best in transition. He likes to get his hands on you. Miami likes to get motion to get guys free releases. The rest of the group I have some questions with Ronald Darby and Antonio Johnson in the nickel. He's long, but can he play in short areas and trigger and attack throwing windows? Or is it Darnell Savage? Do they choose to put him in space and play Johnson on the roof? If they do, how good's his discipline if the Dolphins choose to go up over the top of it and attack either Campbell or Darby on the outside and take some shots vertically down the field? And then the linebackers, I think, are probably more suited to play the run than they are to be really effective zone defenders in the middle of the field. Olakun is a tackle machine. Devin Lloyd, I really like coming out of Utah in 2022. He's a first-round pick for them. They double-dicked and then took Chad Muma out of Wyoming. There's a lot of prototypical frames and length and linear explosiveness in a lot of spots on this defense. But it's linear explosiveness that I think Miami, if they play their skill guys off of each other, I think they can really take advantage of whether it's Tyreek and Jalen against the CB2 or against Tyson Campbell and attack the safeties and attack the middle of the field with the running backs and the agility that those guys have. That's what I expect Miami's going to try to do in this football game. Now, you look over at the other side of the ball and where Jacksonville has strengths, who Trevor Lawrence is as a player. We'll get into that a little bit next here in this primer for Locked On Dolphins as we get ready for the Jaguars in week 1. That's coming your way next. Make sure you stick with us. If you want to get down to the Rock for the game on Sunday, you've got to get your tickets through Gametime. They take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Things I love about Gametime, you get the panoramic view so you know what exactly the sight line is for your tickets before you hit commit and purchase. You get the all-in pricing, so there's no surprises with fees when you put your tickets into your shopping cart and go to checkout. And the Gametime guarantee, they will credit you 110% of the difference if you find cheaper tickets in the same row and section for less somewhere else. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? It's game time. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something you'd love to learn as an adult? Do you make time to learn new things as often as you'd like? Or is that lost in your childhood? Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. What's something that you would like to learn? A new skill, new time management skills. It's a big one for me. A couple of kids in the house. It makes it hard to stay balanced. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder because your back-to-school era can come at any age. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. That's BetterHelp.com/lockedon. Visit today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. One thing that stands out about Jacksonville is this was a team that was a little feast or famine last year offensively. They played San Francisco coming out of their bye week at home and lost by 31 points. They turned the ball over 4 times. They lost in Cleveland 31-27. They turned the ball over offensively 4 times. They played at Pittsburgh, won the game 20-10. They turned the ball over 3 times. They had games against the Colts, the Texans, the Bills, the Ravens, and the Titans with 2 or more turnovers in addition to the ones that we already mentioned. They beat the Falcons with no turnovers. They beat the Titans with no turnovers. They lost in overtime in a game that, frankly, they should have won against the Bengals. Did not turn the ball over in that game. They beat the Panthers with no turnovers. So You talk about turnovers being a key point in any game, but there were times where it came in bunches for Jacksonville. And that's where I have the question of they've got a really good nucleus of talent on both sides of the ball. This is a talented football team and not a team that you should sleep on. But when Gabe Davis is new, when Brian Thomas is new, when Dever Duvernay is new, those players on the perimeter are key pieces for Trevor Lawrence to be the evolved quarterback that they're hoping he is when they made the contract commitment that they did. How on the same page are you? Because if you're not, this is a team that showed last year that, turnovers and mistakes can come in bunches. And if the Dolphins can facilitate that, I think that's one of the big keys to victory. And that's why that's what one thing I like about this being a pressure-oriented defensive scheme and system is I think games like this where your timing has to be pristine because we are going to force faster decisions. And if you're not on the same page and you make decisions faster, we see it with Tua. You have to throw with anticipation. You have to throw and anticipate what your guys are doing and know how they're going to take the break and how many steps they are into the break and when they're getting out of the break and what the spot and the placement of the ball has to be. And if that's wrong, that's where mistakes can happen. And mistakes happening in that case can lead to critical failed conversions on third down, critical misses in tight windows in the red zone, or turnovers. So as I reflect on this potential matchup, I see ways in which Miami can successfully attack. I think you can successfully rush on Cam Robinson at left tackle. The team brought in Mitch Morse, who the team should know quite well. Morse played the last several seasons in Buffalo. He plays center. They have a second-year player in Anton Harrison who looks really good. Looks like he's going to be a really good player for them. As a second-year player, is that somebody that you throw different looks and pressure from second level and hope that he takes the end guy and turns the guy coming through the B gap free based on a big duel, based on where the center's turning, with how you set your fronts. Those are the kinds of things that I'm looking for from a pass rush perspective. And forcing Trevor. Now, Trevor himself is a player, sneaky athlete. I don't think it's something that should be overlooked. And he, of course, is back to fully healthy after getting banged up with a knee injury last year. But he had 339 yards rushing and 4 touchdowns last year. He averaged 4.8 yards per attempt. Almost all that scrambles and getting off your spot. He's the second leading rusher on the team. It was Etienne had 1,000 yards and averaged 3.8 yards per carry. And then it was Trevor at 339. Tank Bigsby, who was a mid-round pick for them last year, had 50 for 132, averaged 2.6 yards per attempt. So I think that's one thing where Mitch Morse, they're kind of hoping can help evolve that. They acquired Ezra Cleveland at the trade deadline last year. Got Brandon Scherf kind of close to end-stage version of himself. I think Zach Sealer, this is a big opportunity to feast with his familiarity with Mitch Morse. Say what you will about Miami and their new center situation. That dynamic does technically exist for Jacksonville too, although you've seen that they've had more snap opportunities in the preseason. So some really compelling matchups all across the board. I'll be interested to see who Jalen Ramsey ends up taking. Does he shadow somebody? Does he shadow Christian Kirk? Do you do the Stephon Gilmore, Bill Belichick plan and press up and shade a safety over top of Christian Kirk and put Ramsey on Gabe Davis and then try to force maybe a little bit more of a raw and unrefined route runner, but a dynamic player down the field in Brian Thomas to make big plays because you're putting Ramsey on one option and then you're not doubling, but you're leveraging another option that's a top option. But then that leaves the middle of the field for Evan Ingram. And Evan Ingram caught a billion passes last year. He had 143 targets, 114 receptions. It's an 80% catch rate on 143 targets. I believe there's an NFL record for receptions for a tight end. Now, that came at 8.4 yards per touch. Not a lot of down the field stuff, but he's an athletic player, not somebody you can miss a tackle on. So they pose some challenges. And we're going to spend the rest of this week kind of looking at those challenges, how the Dolphins can solve those challenges. But that sets the table and lets you know what kind of football team you are dealing with, a team that's probably very hungry to get a bitter taste out of their mouth with how the season ended last year. Jacksonville going from 8-3 to 9-8 and missing the postseason. Dolphins Jaguars at Hard Rock Stadium Sunday. We're going to keep setting the table for it this week. Hope you guys enjoyed this look at the Jaguars. I'll look at some of the injury updates from both teams as we get closer to first injury report, which drops a little later this week. We'll have that covered and the rest of the prep for the game here on Locked On Dolphins. Make sure you keep it locked in. It's your team every day. I appreciate you guys for checking out the show. Make it a good one. And I am out of here. Go Fins.